Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much, Bernadette, for the kind invitation to join you at this year's Speak to the Future Symposium. And the basic aim of this event, which is billed as raising the profile of languages across all key sectors of UK society, is so fundamentally important, and particularly for all of us who are painfully aware of the general record of foreign language attainment in this country. There's a lot of work to do. Thanks for your kind of introduction, Bernadette. So I'm John Benjamin. I've been director of the Foreign Office's Diplomatic Academy since August, so just for a couple of months after returning from Ghana. I'm joined by a couple of colleagues, so Ian Felton, who is the head of our languages team at the Foreign Office, and Agnes Walker, who's our languages expert. So feel free to follow up with them during the break after this session. In my case, I've been a British diplomat for over 31 years, but a devotee of language learning since my very formative years, long before that. But I am a bit of a Foreign Office cliche in that I joined the diplomatic service with fluent French, German and Swedish, and I've pretty much never ever used any of those languages professionally ever since. However, I have been very fortunate in being able to learn Indonesian, Turkish and Spanish on the FCO's time and expense prior to postings where I use those languages daily and intensively as a core part of my job. And Spanish was the last of those languages which I acquired in 2009, in already my late 40s at that time, prior to becoming ambassador in Chile, which is what I did before I went to Ghana. And in Chile, I also acquired a Chilean spouse and son, as a result of which we now only speak Chilean Spanish at home here in London. So I hope I just about passed muster in such a distinguished linguistic setting as this. But I do also feel that a bit like living proof of the adage that it just becomes so much more difficult to learn a new language the older one gets. And so I think I've hung up my boots as regards trying to learn any more languages in the future. Just trying to keep hold of the ones I've learned in the past is difficult enough. Now, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the FCO, as you know, is basically there as the part of the British government that promotes the United Kingdom's interests overseas, supporting our citizens and businesses around the globe, promoting our values, advocating for the strengthening of a rules-based international system. And we do that through a large network of currently 274 posts in 168 countries and territories, including in multilateral organizations. And that large network is staffed by FCO staff, and the FCO is also responsible for running that global platform. But we also have many other colleagues from well over 20 other UK government departments who work on that platform overseas. So in total, we have about 15,000 people on that international platform, and about 12,000 or 3/4 of them are locally employed staff, and most often of the nationality of the countries where those posts are. And that global network of embassies, of high commissions, consulates, permanent representations, other offices is vital in helping the UK government pursue its international objectives. And we try to do that through our knowledge of different parts of the world, our knowledge of languages, of cultures, of political economies, and through diplomatic tradecraft, the skills such as negotiating, influencing, policy formulation, program delivery, and again, all in pursuit of achieving the goal of a more secure and prosperous UK in a more secure and prosperous world, while protecting British citizens overseas who need our help. Now, amongst our UK diplomats posted abroad, in any one year, we have between 500 and 600 operating in designated so-called speaker slots, which require a C1 or C2 level under the Common European Framework in the language spoken in the country where they're posted. And so in other words, speaker slots are diplomatic posts abroad where we consider real functional fluency is an indispensable requirement of the job, not some sort of desirable or optional extra. And that requirement for functional operational fluency applies to oral presentation, comprehension, and reading, especially less so to writing, as typically in our posts overseas we'll have native speaker local staff colleagues able to translate formal text to a higher standard than a non-native speaker could achieve. And they help us draft more informal work like social media posts, although I tweet regularly in the languages I described earlier. Once one of our colleagues has secured a posting which is designated as a speaker slot, they then enter a language teaching program with a quite specific course learning plan. And following that training, the person concerned, the colleague concerned, takes an exam based on specific work-based tasks. For example, speaking tasks involving negotiating an agreement, perhaps presenting a case, also listening to broadcasts about emerging political developments in a particular country, so that that simulates having to analyze a situation and report it back to London. And that also helps with a sort of, I guess you could call it area studies approach to language training, where the focus is, of course, primarily on effective linguistic acquisition, but the materials used, political, economic, media, and so on, also help the officer concerned by osmosis to absorb valuable preparatory lessons about the country and the society and the region they're about to go and work in. And the overwhelming majority of our teachers at the Foreign Office Language School are, of course, native speakers. Now, that general approach is something we consider vital because we need colleagues out in the field who can really get under the skin of the countries they're in. People who can communicate effectively with and influence key contacts on a very wide range of issues, and often operate in the local traditional and social media, something that over the last few years as a head of mission in Chile and Ghana I found myself doing on a daily basis. And you can only really do that by becoming highly proficient in the relevant language, even in countries where there is a high general standard of English in otherwise non-native English-speaking environments. And of course, in fast-moving crises, whether they're political crises or dealing with all the people recently stranded by the collapse of Monarch Airlines, for example, we need diplomats who are able to operate independently without having to rely on local colleagues to translate or interpret for them. So in other words, the picture I'm trying to paint is that foreign language skills are a vital part of doing diplomacy well. It's as simple as that. And that's why we have an extensive system of language training and testing to achieve those language learning goals. And it's why we invest quite significantly in it with a budget of over £4 million annually. And we celebrate achievement. So we're launching internally a Languages Impact Award to capture and celebrate how Foreign Office staff most effectively use their language skills in practice. Our most senior diplomat, our most senior official, who's called Sir Simon MacDonald, the Permanent Secretary at the Foreign Office and head of the Diplomatic Service, well, he's a very active champion internally of language learning, particularly of our priority languages, and they are Arabic, Russian, Mandarin Chinese, Spanish, and French. Languages which he often points out cover up to 2/3 of the world in which we operate. Sir Simon MacDonald, he's an excellent German speaker. He was our previous ambassador in Berlin. Caroline Wilson, who was originally billed to be with us today, who's our Europe director. You can imagine as Europe director, she has one or two other issues to be dealing with at the moment. But she's a very impressive linguist. She's also the Foreign Office's language champion within Whitehall. She speaks Russian, Mandarin, and German. Our ambassador in Beijing, Barbara Woodward, is fluent in Chinese and Russian, and there are so many other examples around the FCO network of excellent linguists making daily and high-level use of their linguistic skills. So at the language school, which forms part of our diplomatic academy at the Foreign Office, we put particular effort into those priority languages. Again, I repeat, they are Arabic, Russian, Mandarin, Spanish, and French. We also have 6 priority 2 languages, which are Farsi, German, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, and Turkish. And we're building a very strong pipeline of speakers in those languages. Something we hope will be bolstered by the imminent graduate intake for this year of over 50 new Foreign Office colleagues, 70% of whom, I'm glad to say, scored very high marks in the Modern Languages Aptitude Test, or MLAT, which is part of the application process for joining the diplomatic service. And in the last year, we've delivered full-time language training, for example, to 43 officers in Arabic, 23 in Mandarin, and 11 in Russian. But beyond those priority languages, we do also, through our languages team, which Ian heads, provide training in up to 85 foreign languages. Though, as you can imagine, the demand for some of them is both low and pretty infrequent. So, for example, I don't know, randomly guessing maybe something like Slovenian or Burmese. You're talking really about, given that people typically do 4-year postings in those countries, maybe 1 or 2 people every 4 years. So the annual budget of over 4 million that I mentioned covers lots of language training. It's delivered both in our state-of-the-art language centre, which is in the Foreign Office building, which was formerly tragically closed in about 2007, but very happily reopened in 2013. But we also teach overseas in the form of in-country immersion training. Once a student has achieved operational proficiency, experience suggests that students make most progress if they do start here, rather than being immediately immersed in the language environment. But once they've reached basic operational proficiency, then they really motor on by being sent out to the country concerned. At any given moment, we have about a little over 200 Foreign Office staff on full-time language training. Other staff can undertake self-study at the language centre, including in the form of developmental classes at lunchtime or after work. We also provide training to staff from other government departments, preparing for posting overseas. We take part in a cross-Whitehall group on language training, including several other departments which have their own quite deep organisational and operational need for languages, such as the Ministry of Defence, with its network of defence attaches and serving military personnel posted overseas, the National Crime Agency, all the agencies involved in intelligence and protecting our national security. In the language centre, we operate either on a one-to-one basis or increasingly on a very small class basis, and which we believe brings real benefits. We have 3 outside providers on a commercial contract who provide services to us. So we have Language Services Direct, who provide all languages except French. The Institut Français in South Kensington provide our French teaching, and the Chartered Institute of Linguists set the exams that our language students have to take. Now, they're typically the time given to learn a language from 0 to a very high standard is relatively short, so it ranges, say, from 8 months for French to 22 months for Mandarin, but on a full-time basis. And it's important to stress that language training is not some sort of nice, relaxing alternative to a busy desk job. It's hard, intensive work in itself, not least because staff are firmly expected to take and pass the exams at the end, which are very demanding. And Anne Carlisle, was Anne of the CEO of the Institute of Linguists, part of the panel shortly, make sure that those exams are of a very, very high standard. I can testify to that, having had the daylight scared out of me by taking various of them over the years. And we're also ramping up the expectation on our staff in speaker slots that they must pass their exams. They're part of their appraisal of their annual performance. It will be based on how they do in those exams. And right now we have 72% of our heads of mission overseas in non-English speaking environments who have passed the target level set for them in the language relevant to the country they're in. And we're trying to increase that to 80% and more by 2020. So I could say a lot more about a language offer. Time doesn't permit me. I'd mention only that we do offer developmental training for officers to maintain their levels of proficiency after they've finished a posting, when they're no longer using the language in their daily work. And obviously, I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that in the case of the hardest languages, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, those languages where we basically invest 2 years in an officer and a large six-figure sum in doing so, there is a career expectation that they will serve in that part of the world 2, 3, maybe even 4 times in the course of a long career. We also provide optional training to help staff overseas who are not in one of those designated speaker slots, but who want to reach at least survival level in order to understand better the environment they're operating in, to get more out of the experience, frankly. So the bottom line is we have many colleagues out there in the British diplomatic network performing daily at a very high standard in numerous languages, engaging publicly and privately with the media, political elites, business communities, and many others to promote UK interests, including promoting our reputation as the UK as a world leader in the projection of what's become known as soft power. So I hope that's a useful summary of what we do at the FCO. Just to finish off, given that a theme of the panel discussion I'm about to join shortly, and of the whole day, regards the UK's place in the post-Brexit world, I hope a few words on that subject might be apposite. Bear in mind, please, however, that as a senior government official and senior servant, I'm not here to offer my personal views on the pros and cons of Brexit or to respond to any questions about how the government is handling negotiations, however much you try and provoke me to do so in any questions that follow. But I would say, speaking personally with regard to that overarching background that we're operating in, of how to work out what Brexit means, if the UK's global future post-Brexit is one of a country that's opening much more also to the rest of the world, and where our bilateral relations with leading European countries in a way become more important because we're a future non-member of the EU, then it ought to stand to reason, even if it's a bit of a simplistic assertion, that becoming proficient in languages should over time become more, not less, of a national priority. And at the same time, though, and again, for the sake of provoking discussion, not, I hope, an argument afterwards, I do wonder a little bit, though, if with regards to the approach to foreign language learning in the UK, the Brexit debate isn't also a little bit of a red herring. And I mean that in the sense that our national prowess at languages was generally perceived as pretty poor before we joined the EU 45 years ago, nearly, and now is still perceived as pretty poor. Despite those 4 decades and more of the free movement of people, of student exchange schemes such as Erasmus, and the whole panoply of millions of professional, commercial, and private interactions between British and other European citizens, we still nationally don't have a linguistic record to be particularly proud of. With or without EU membership, then, the UK seems to remain, sadly, on the whole, a stubbornly monolingual country. And I was struck very much by the way that one of the sessions later on today is called "Is Monolingualism Making Us Ill?" which is an interesting way of putting it. And that, of course, is despite the fact that in parts of the UK, in Scotland and Wales, for example, we have official non-English languages within the UK. Or the fact that here in fabulously diverse and multicultural London, we have over a third of the population who were born not only outside this city, but outside this country, and who between them speak literally dozens of languages as a daily reality. That's part of our daily lived experience in London, and yet, again, our national record is not one that we can be particularly proud of. I mentioned earlier that one of the languages I speak is Swedish. That's because I both studied it at university and then spent some of my formative adult years, early adult years there, working in a bank in Gothenburg. And I recall vividly now, over 35 years later, that actually the most difficult thing for me about becoming fluent in Swedish was not its inherent linguistic difficulty. And in fact, at the FCO, we rank languages in kind of 6 divisions of difficulty, and Swedish is in the lowest or easiest of those, that league table of language difficulty. But rather, the most difficult thing was the fact that such a high percentage of Swedes of all socio-economic, ethnic, internal, regional, and other backgrounds are taught to speak such excellent English. So my main challenge in the early days of my halting attempts to communicate was that people, Swedes, who I interacted with, colleagues, friends, would immediately switch unbidden into English rather than suffer through my initial childlike version of their language. And frankly, there's not too much of a risk that a foreign student of English in the UK falls linguistically short because the Brits they interact with keep switching into their mother tongue. It's not likely to happen. To put some figures on that, a recent World Economic Forum study suggested that around 2/3 or 65% of EU citizens aged 25 to 64 are proficient in at least one language other than their habitual principal mother tongue, with the figures for Scandinavia and Baltic countries into the 90%, nearly 80% in Germany, and around 60% in France and Italy. Now, interestingly, that same study didn't give a figure for the UK, but instinctively, I think we can all sadly guess that it's considerably lower. And of course, we have our domestic internal figures. We have the regular language trends survey. I believe there were some new Department for Education figures which came out yesterday, which analysed the recent A-level and GCSE results. And there's some depressing figures in there. I'm told that only 1% of all A-level students nationally last year took Spanish. Only 0.5% of all A-levels taken were in German. And at O-level, I'm giving my age away, GCSE, what used to be called O-level. The number of pupils entered for at least one language back in the year 2000 was about 70% of the whole cohort. But soon after that, 2004, I think, of course, languages ceased to be a compulsory national curriculum subject, and the figure for the percentage of the GCSE cohort entered for languages dropped to as low as 40% in 2010. And I think it's recovered a little since, but it's still very worrying. So events like this, and Speak to the Future's general efforts, are vital in restating the need for a revival in the teaching of and our basic national societal interest in teaching foreign languages as a key to understanding and interacting with the UK's partners in Europe and around the world. And as I hope I've described at the FCO, we regard language teaching as a key and indispensable tool for the way our staff are able to operate effectively in different societies across the globe. So you'll always find us at the FCO firmly supportive of your efforts to promote nationally the central importance and inherent value of learning languages, whatever our particular background or walk of life. So thanks again for this invitation, and we'll always support you in your efforts to proselytize more for foreign languages. Thanks. Well,
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Bernadette, for that overly kind introduction and hospital pass of a question on Brexit. It's a real pleasure for me to be here to join you today to talk about something which is very close to my heart, this theme of language learning, cultural awareness, and its importance to our future economic success. So often we tend to talk about this subject in the context of young people's educational journey, or we talk about it in the context of culture, but we don't often talk about it in the context of prosperity and in the context of our future success. I think we need to up the volume on that, and that's why I'm delighted to be here with you today and to join you, who I know are all passionate champions for making the case for languages. As Bernadette says, I represent businesses of all sizes in every nation and region of the UK. We also now have a burgeoning network of British Chambers of Commerce operating overseas as well. So if you were to go from Manchester to Mexico City, we have a British Chamber of Commerce at either end of that journey. And one of the things that our chambers overseas are now doing, interestingly, is helping businesses get acclimated to the cultures that they are often taking their first steps in, so that they can be successful in dealing with the businesses that they encounter thereafter. How does business think about languages? Well, I think the first thing I'd say is it doesn't think about languages. It thinks about the skills of the individuals that it needs in order to achieve whatever goals it has set in its strategy. And the thing that businesses do think about is overseas experience, intercultural awareness, and from that, languages become important because, of course, languages are a great indicator of someone possessing those skill sets which businesses are after in order to expand either in the UK or into a particular overseas market. Intercultural skills of any description are also an indicator to a lot of our businesses these days of overall employability. Businesses are less and less convinced by qualifications of any description and more convinced by individuals' experiences of life, the world of work, and cultures around the world. So when they look and they say, I don't really get the difference between the academic qualifications of candidate A, candidate B, and candidate C, that intercultural experience, linguistic ability, etc., starts to become a differentiating factor for businesses in deciding who they take on. So what sorts of things do they look for? Well, experience working in or with businesses overseas is an obvious starting point. But even time spent living and working abroad, even when someone is in their youth, is something which attracts businesses' eye. Volunteering overseas is something which now increasingly attracts businesses' eye because it is another indicator of employability and also that sort of fuzzy concept of grit which a lot of employers are after. If someone has spent a spell overseas, possibly under difficult conditions, volunteering, learning about a different culture, learning another language, they see that very positively. And of course, yes, they do look at language ability as another differentiator, including but not limited to qualifications. I think what's interesting when you get away from the academic debate about languages, however, is that businesses are far less obsessed with native or fluent speakers and far more obsessed with having people on their books who can give it a go. And I think we need to differentiate between those two groups. It's very important. John did a little bit in his remarks between those who are in designated speaker roles and those who need to have a functional understanding of language. Well, those distinctions exist in business as well. If you are a frontline customer service representative needing to attend to clients in Greek, they want you to be fluent in Greek or a native speaker of Greek, obviously. But if you are in some other function within the business, for example, your level of proficiency may not have to be that perfect. And I think that's where we as Brits have got a cultural problem, which is that we are very, very reticent to use any language skills we may have acquired in public for fear of embarrassment. It's stupid, but it's true. If we can get over that, and we can start demonstrating intermediate levels of proficiency or even the sort of survival levels of proficiency, of course, the individual in question gains in confidence, but the business also starts to invest more in that individual's proficiency, and you see a virtuous sort of circle emerging. So I think one of the biggest things that businesses say to us vis-a-vis languages and the people that they have on their books, I'll use an acronym because I don't want to use the full phrase. It's JFDI. I will leave you to guess what that means. It involves a swear word or two. They want people to get out there and do it. And with languages, it's no different. They want them to get out there and use the capacity that they have for the good of the business and for their own personal advancement, and then they are willing to invest and build on it from there. So the attitudes towards business don't start from, do you have the C1 level of qualification, or have you got an A level in this subject, or whatever else it might be. It's, show me what you can do and how we can use it and why it's good for our business's future success. And when we start talking about things in that way, languages sort of come to life, I think, in the workplace a little bit. Coming on then to the trade challenge and Brexit, Bernadette's lovely question to set me up a little bit earlier. I actually think that Brexit is a huge opportunity for those of us who care about languages and language learning, and who care about the UK's ability to pay its way in the world through international trade. Many of you will know that we have a very significant current account deficit. Our trade balances are not positive in a lot of sectors, and that we need to do a lot more to get out there into the world. We in Chambers of Commerce work with well in excess of 30,000 exporting companies every year on everything from translations, foreign currency hedging, through to in-market services. We do a lot of the nitty-gritty of international trade together with businesses, but we know we need to get more of them out there, because there's still plenty of firms that aren't out there. And having language ability, having intercultural skills, the agility and the ability to adapt that those give to the individuals within a business would be a huge boon to our potential to achieve that. Markets where we have traditionally not been big players are areas where we have big opportunities. And I think first and foremost, this might be because I'm like John, I acquired Spanish through marriage, but I acquired Valencian Spanish rather than Chilean Spanish, so we may not understand each other when we talk. But the Latin American market, I think, is one where the UK has classically and traditionally underplayed its hand. 150 years ago, British products were the absolute must in many of those countries. About 50 years ago, we stopped paying attention completely, said the Spanish and the Portuguese have this all sewn up, so we'll leave it alone. Big mistake. Everyone, but everyone in those markets wants to do more business with us. So Spanish and Portuguese, hugely, hugely important, I think, to our ability to crack an area of the world where we've been traditionally less present. Obviously, a lot of our businesses are operating intensively in the Middle East, and they see Brexit actually as a push for us to do more in many of the Middle Eastern countries. The Gulf states, for example, share many of our standards for products. They use British standards. They have used a number of British concepts in their legal systems, and those similarities and those familiarities lead to Arabic being increasingly important, perhaps in the post-Brexit world, for many of our businesses. Mandarin Chinese I need not speak about, because it's obviously important to every country doing business with China, and of course for us as well. I think it will be increasingly important in future. But, and John mentioned Indonesian in particular, but the ASEAN countries are another area of the world with a great hunger to do more business with us. So if we think about the Indonesian and Malay family, we think about Thai, we think about Vietnamese, these are other areas where there may be big opportunity. And having just a small number of speakers, but who can do the business in some of these countries, could be transformative to our future prospects. Markets where we want to grow trade after Brexit, but where English is the primary business language, still need intercultural understanding in order to do business successfully. I'm, as you can probably tell from my accent, a slightly mid-Atlantic individual. I grew up half in the United States and half in this country. Doing business in the United States is a million miles away from doing business in the United Kingdom. And there are lazy assumptions among some of our businesses sometimes that going to other English-speaking countries is easy in business. Simple answer is it's not. There are regulatory differences, there are differences in standards, there are differences in business culture, which are enormous. And I was reminded of that in Australia just 2 weeks ago, when a couple of my hosts reminded me of a couple of visits that they'd had from a couple of British businesses that literally did not understand how they did business in Australia and made too many assumptions that it was like doing business at home. So having intercultural understanding derived from living overseas, language learning, etc., will help us not just in markets where we need the languages on a day-to-day basis, but where we need the cultural understanding as well. That would extend to the Indian subcontinent, to many of the African nations who use English as their business language as well. We have got to remember that that cultural understanding and that immersion is important to our businesses. So just to conclude, I don't want to leave it in any doubt. Businesses very much value language skills. but their approach to thinking about language is indirect. They think about it through their personnel needs and their strategic needs. Language then becomes an answer or part of the solution rather than what they were seeking in the first place. It's a means to an end, not an end in itself. And I think sometimes when we talk about the languages in forums like this, the language is the end in itself. For business, it is the means. We need to remember that. We do need to get far better as a country at acquiring those skills, but even more so than acquiring them, it's demonstrating them. Even if they're imperfect, show that we can do it, because that creates confidence. And in that intercultural relationship that is a business transaction, even a small and short-lived attempt to speak someone else's language often opens the door to having a contract signed or a negotiation completed. I think finally as well that Brexit will make those who have those great international and intercultural skills far more valuable on the jobs market of tomorrow. If we only have a limited pool of people who are good at doing business overseas, the law of supply and demand suggests that their wages will be higher, their premiums will be greater, and they will be sought after by many, many of our firms. So for those who are in that particular area at the moment, for those who are studying languages at the moment, my point would be this. It's great to be doing that because your market value probably will start to increase in the years to come. But if you go into the jobs market saying, I did a language degree, not going to help you. If you go into the jobs market saying, here's what I can do, and by the way, I also have qualifications in a language, you get a completely different response. And I hope we start thinking about things from that practical perspective, because that's the way we're going to get past Brexit, we're going to increase our language abilities, and we're going to increase how much business we do around the world. Thank you, everyone.
We've got half an hour to change the world. So I'm actually going to ask John and Adam initially, what, if anything, on a purely practical level, has changed in your areas of activity since Article 50 was triggered? So, you know, what has changed, and what can you do? John first.
Well, everything's changed. I said earlier that, you know, I hope everyone can appreciate that in my position I can't wade into British domestic politics, but it barely needs saying that this is the number one issue in British domestic politics, and presumably will be for quite a long time to come.
And do you think that
so it changes everything?
And do you think that international attitudes have already changed to us significantly?
I think it depends where you are. That's a very good question, because there is always a danger of being a bit myopic, whoever you are and wherever you are, and thinking that your preoccupations are necessarily those of everybody else. So I think within Europe, it's obviously a very major issue. My experience from just having been in Ghana and Chile, which are two pretty diverse examples, is that we shouldn't assume that the rest of the world looks at Britain through the prism of Brexit. In fact, in many parts of the world, people don't have a very deep understanding of what the EU is and how it operates. It's often too complex or too distant to really resonate. And there are plenty of countries around the world that, whatever their attitude generally to the UK is, along the whole spectrum from very positive to more negative, they don't primarily see us through the prism of the EU. They see us as a trading partner, as perhaps as an aid donor, because we're the only major advanced industrialized nation that's reached the 0.7% gross national income target for overseas development aid. So don't assume that the rest of the world is either sees us in terms of Brexit or is as preoccupied by
Adam,
Brexit
you're
as we
nodding
are.
your head, and I imagine you agree.
I completely agree. Brexit is seen as the predominant issue here in the United Kingdom. Even amongst our European partners, it's only one of a number of things that they're facing at the moment. And we have to be a little bit less myopic and realize there's a whole big world out there that has different relationships with us and act accordingly. I think in terms of what's happened since Article 50, a lot of businesses are evaluating the markets where they operate. And in doing so, they are thinking about the potential costs and benefits of working in different markets or changing their orientation from what it is now to something that reflects the post-Brexit environment. And that makes language, intercultural understanding, market knowledge is something that will be at a premium as they look at reevaluating where they do business. So we will see quite a lot of that. But I actually think that two things will shape what happens going forward. The first is if we demonstrate that we want to be a global and outward-looking country rather than be a bunch of little Englanders, that will be hugely, hugely important to how the rest of the world wants to deal with us in a post-Brexit environment. And the second, it sounds like a world away from the language question that we're talking about, but the way we design a future immigration policy will also have an enormous impact on how we are perceived around the world. The Prime Minister went to India earlier in the year, and whilst they got on famously, her and the Indian Prime Minister, on everything relating to trade, some of their discussions foundered on the question of visas and immigration. We have to prove that we are open and outward-looking and open to exchanges of talent as well with other countries around the world if we are to succeed as a global Britain in future.
Charles, what is your view on this particular point, whether international attitudes have changed? You work in international law.
My experience is particularly within the European continent, and I think post-Brexit what I've noticed is the immediate sense of loss of influence and loss of trust. And if we want to do business there, many of them are looking at the UK and saying, well, frankly, it would be an awful lot easier if our supply chains were within the continent and not involving crossing the North Sea. We've increased the barriers to doing business with us in terms of perception. For the last few decades, we've effectively outsourced our language capability by hiring foreigners. The city is full of them. They may still be welcome here if the Prime Minister carries through what she has said, but the perception is it's going to be harder. Sterling has dropped in value. It makes it, if you're choosing where to live and work, the UK is perhaps now lower down the list. When we're dealing with them, the loss of influence of the UK means, why should we have to speak English just because of you? You've really got to fight against that. The need to have a go, which Adam mentioned, I think is so important. It can break the ice. And actually, in many cases, you don't need to be able to speak it. You need to be able to read what the piece of paper has to say. Even if you muddle through, you can read a bit of Dutch from a bit of German and get there. So I think we really do need to fight back within the European context. I appreciate the rest of the world, things may be still much the same.
Anne Carlisle next to you. Now, the role of the CIOL, the Chartered Institute of Linguists, is to enhance and promote the value of languages, to promote academic and business and language skills. Has your job changed perceptibly since Article 50, the triggering Article 50?
Things are changing, but at the risk of being slightly controversial and perhaps picking up on one of the points earlier, we represent about 7,500 linguists at the moment, and a proportion of those come from Europe. The rest come from around the world, and the work that we do means representing members with around 60 different nationalities. We operate and accredit linguists in about 40 plus countries around the world, and we deliver exams in 50 plus languages. So we extend our reach already well beyond Europe. Now, for our members and the people who come to us for qualifications, there is clearly concern about what happens in the future. But what I think Brexit may do, and of course none of us absolutely know what the impact will be, I'm an optimist and a pragmatist. I think there will be opportunities for us, and I think it will intensify the requirements for language and language learning and language competency, rather than move us away from that. And picking up on something else which is very close to my heart, my background is in language teaching, language training, and particularly languages at work. So I've worked in education, I've worked in government, I've worked in business. And what I support wholly is the idea that we don't all have to be fluent. I know we may come back to that, but actually matching the language capability we have with the needs that we have is important. People use language for transactions, to get stuff done. Business will use them if they've got it to improve their bottom line. They're not interested in the linguist, they're interested in their business, but languages may come into it. We use it to engage, and that's really important, and it's a communicative skill. I've never yet seen a job description that doesn't talk about interpersonal and communicative skills. And of course, we do also have the sort of doing it for the love of it, the academic study, through which we get our specialist language professionals. And all three of those are important, and I don't think are going to go away because of Brexit.
I'll actually twist it a little bit, because I recently actually went out to market to try and hire a Dutch speaker and found it extremely difficult in London to find a fluent Dutch speaker to join the team, which goes to show that what we're predicting, which would be eventually a challenge of the language pool drying up because of the uncertainties, whether free movement or anything else, is actually happening now.
Do we have to focus on certain areas much more than others?
It's a hard question to answer, because there's an assumption that we will know what the impacts of change are going to be in the very short term, when in fact they're more likely to be medium to long term impacts, and we'll only understand them with the benefit of a bit of hindsight and in 5 to 10 years' time. I mean, I'd echo what Panos was saying, though, about immediate needs that up until now have been serviced by the readily available pool of candidates wanting to work in a successful country with a relatively highly valued currency in an atmosphere of stability. Those are the people which business is worried about right now. And I have spent a lot of my time since June the 24th of last year campaigning very, very hard for the 3 million European citizens who work in our businesses to be given the maximum amount of security possible and an unconditional guarantee by the UK government. And the reason for that is our firms are very scared of losing people. We've had about 1 in 10 who have already lost people, and about 40% who say their European employees are actively considering going. So if we lose, as Panos was saying, the talent pool that we already have, the scarcity question is simply going to worsen as we get into the medium term. So we have to hold on to that existing talent pool, and then as we start to see what this change entails, we'll start to uncover other things that we will need to do in order to get the right candidates for roles. But it's not something where you can say right away, I know today that this sector will be the most affected, etc., etc.
And that's part of the problem, isn't it? The lack of course, the insecurity, not knowing what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain sectors where European citizens have dominated quite a lot. So front of house in hospitality and leisure industries, for example, where their language skills are also incredibly valued with international guests and things like that. That is an area where we know we will have a problem sooner. But there are big swathes of the economy where we won't know until later.
Now, John, you've already pinpointed the languages that you are focusing on as the priority languages. Now, that seems to make sense, does it not, for the whole of the UK to focus on those languages?
No, I think every organisation that has a structural approach to language training has to make their own call. It really comes from, if we're going to improve the national general ability in languages, it comes from discussions with the Department for Education about what languages we teach in the curriculum, for how long, whether they're obligatory, and so on. There are many other cultural changes which have never really taken root here. I mentioned my experience in Sweden, how difficult it was because of how well people are taught to speak English, and there are factors there that, for example, as simple as any TV program that people grew up watching there, including children's TV from quite an early age, are subtitled. Even though I've just returned to the UK after 12 years away and have bought a cable package with far too many channels on it, I can't find foreign language films that are subtitled very easily.
Okay.
So it's not in our bloodstream. So a lot of it is about getting foreign languages more into the cultural bloodstream. That's why I said earlier that that it's that aspect where I think the Brexit aspect is very incredibly important, but could be a bit of a red herring because we've never managed to do that. And even after these 45 years of close integration with Europe, we don't seem to have fundamentally changed. So that's the real challenge.
But I think what we need to see more of is initiative in business where companies are proactively looking at their objectives and designing language strategies to align and support it, and not treat language as a second-class soft skill citizen when it's those soft skills that are going to build the relationships you need in an outward-looking economy.
Now, Adam, does that feed into what you were saying earlier as well? Because even though you say that languages shouldn't be top of the tree as an ambition, I mean, there has to be a language strategy. Surely each business has to have a language strategy.
Yeah, it's using language as the means to the business end, but planning for how you're going to do that. So I'd agree with Panos that a lot of businesses aren't good enough at thinking about that and doing it proactively.
How can they do it?
Well, if you incentivize businesses, they tend to do things. And one thing that's always bothered me is that right now there's something called the annual investment allowance. I won't bore you with what it is, but it basically lets businesses offset certain expenses against their tax bills. And right now it's only good for certain things, plant and machinery investments, for example. If you could offset more training costs against your investment allowance, you'd see a lot more small and medium-sized firms thinking about, oh, I need to train in international skills, and I can offset that against a future tax bill. That's worth doing. It's worth investing in. Those kinds of changes are very technical, but actually in the world of business where we think constantly about the P&L, would actually get more probably doing what Panos is talking about.
Okay, Charles, I want to ask you. I mean, if we're talking about blueprints for the future, which is what we are doing, and there is a significant gap in language skills, but also in skills in the UK, and languages are part of that. I mean, how much do you think it will cost, and what do we actually have to do to fill this gap?
I was thinking as the others were talking about the languages, and John was particularly mentioning Mandarin and Arabic. At Linklaters, we are quite open about specifically targeting to recruit trainee lawyers who can speak Mandarin, Arabic, and indeed African languages.
So you go out specifically to seek linguists who are lawyers, or lawyers who are linguists?
They're at the student stage. So the primary requirement is that they have the potential to be good lawyers. Language training, you don't recruit someone who speaks the most beautiful language and hope you can turn them into a lawyer. It's easy to do it the other way around, I'm afraid. But when it comes to Mandarin, Arabic, and the African languages, you're basically recruiting people who have grown up speaking those languages as one of their mother tongues. And of course, there is no cost in that. The cost is in the other languages. And so the European languages, French, German, Russian, Spanish, which are particularly valuable. But the point I'm making is that if you can teach people one of the easier languages, you have broken the confidence barrier. And having got one language, particularly that way you have learnt the structure of grammar and syntax, which isn't so apparent in English, it's much easier then to move on to another one.
Now, Anne, we have an incredible wealth of languages in this country already. I mean, we speak quite often at these conferences about community languages and so on. We have a large proportion of our population already speaking second languages. So, I mean, are you find there's enough encouragement in those areas, enough investment in schools, education, in the languages we have already?
I think there's a lot more we could do. And I think we sometimes forget that that's part of our language capability in the country, that there's a tremendous wealth of second languages, heritage languages, half-learnt languages because you've spent a few years living somewhere, and counting those alongside the sort of active language learning that we promote. The other thing which is sort of linked, and I wanted to say, is that what we don't do very readily is, I think, is encourage a love of languages. I think teaching a specific language very young has some advantages. My personal view is that perhaps at primary level, we should actually be encouraging children to listen to the languages they hear around them, identify them, teach them about language, about how languages are related to one another, to different parts of the world, to culture. And out of that, they will learn a language, and there does need to be better continuity through school to develop specific skills. And that's particularly important, again, so that we have professional specialist linguists at the top end.
Panos, as Director of Europe, I mean, how are you encouraging the professional linguists? Do professional linguists still have a role, do you think?
There is a role, and there always will be, and I think it's already been touched on today in terms of, are you going for outright fluency or functional capability? I think they're both important depending on the role and where you are in the world.
You'd expect me to say this, Chartered Institute of Linguists, but, you know, professional linguists, interpreters, translators, and people who use languages primarily as their function at work, you know, are here to stay. If you want legal advice, you look for a professional lawyer. If you want your books done, you go to a professional accountant. And, you know, when you want high-level specialist translating, interpreting, we're trying to say, go to a professional linguist, look for someone who's chartered, and put that profession alongside all of the other chartered and other professions, so it gets the recognition it deserves.
I am going to push you all now to come up with your rallying cry, your solution to all our ills, and hopefully to make this a very soft Brexit as far as languages go. Also, I want to, should languages be compulsory?
4 things. 1, start in primary schools and make it compulsory. 2, focus on usage, not fluency. 3, incentivize businesses to train more in language. And 4, celebrate and promote the fact that we want to be global and we want to have these abilities. Unless we believe in it, we won't do it.
Fantastic. And John Benjamin.
Yeah, well, look, a rallying cry, you'd expect, since I'm paid to make rallying cries, but also fundamentally believe in a rallying cry about the UK. This is an unsettling time, I think, for everybody, wherever they stand on the Brexit Remain spectrum. But we're still, depending on how you measure it, the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. We are a member, we have a seat at all the top tables internationally, including the UN Security Council. And even within Europe, if you look at all the UN demographic trends for the rest of this century, by the middle of the century, by 2050, which sounds a long way away, but is 1 generation away effectively, under any projection, the UK may by then have overtaken Germany as the largest country in Europe with a population of around 80 million. There are lots of reasons why we should, whatever the uncertainty presently, we shouldn't get into some downward spiral of doing ourselves down. I think with languages particularly, I agree very much with your first point. I think we said this earlier. There needs to be a debate. The Department for Education is central to it. Do we again make a language, perhaps more than one language, compulsory? Do we start earlier? Do we make it compulsory all the way up, at least to GCSE? I think you can change behaviour in 2 ways, or along a spectrum. At one end of the spectrum is encouraging people, persuading people. Then there are various kind of more subtle nudge techniques, and at the other end of the spectrum is compulsion, an obligation, and they're not mutually exclusive. You can have elements of all of that, and what we've lost, it seems to me, is the compulsion element.
The nudge technique. There's a Nobel Prize. Handing it to you now already. And Charles Clarke, your rallying cry.
It's difficult to follow these excellent suggestions. If people can go and live and work or do something in another country that isn't an English-speaking country, they'll come back with a completely different outlook on their own country, a different way of thinking. And I think it's stimulating that curiosity in schools. I'm not an educationist, but I can't help thinking we ought to be using the technologies, digital learning.
Absolutely, and that's very much what Rosetta Stone is doing as well. Thank you so much for that. And Anne Carlisle.
Yes, compulsory. Why on earth not? And just 3 points that are sort of drawn from the Brexit paper produced by the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Languages, and it skirts on some of the things that we've talked about today. Access to Erasmus Plus and other European programmes. Absolutely critical if we're going to expect people to go out and gain the kind of experience that we've heard everyone on the panel talk about today. The right to remain and the right for free movement between the countries of Europe and Britain, so that we retain the diversity and sort of language wealth that we have, and also that we replicate anything, but in particular, the paper talked about the legislation offering the right to interpreting and translation services during court proceedings, replicating that to make sure, again, that languages are put to the best use they possibly can and serve the purposes, in that case, of some of the most vulnerable people who need them.
Thank you so much. And Panos Praniotis.
Thanks, Rosie. Yeah, from my side, I think it's we're finally in a position where the language debate is front row center where it should be, and we should hopefully see movement at government level to, yes, absolutely compulsory for everyone at school, incentivized at least in academia, to Adam's comments. And then in some way they're motivated or subsidized in the workplace. I think languages has to now be mission critical for everyone as opposed to just some secondary skill. And we need an internationally minded population so that you can look outwards, internationally curious at least, to be able to investigate outwards.
Every single statement is so valuable. These are real treasures. These are gems. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you to Adam Marshall, John Benjamin, Charles Clark, Anne Carlisle, and Panos Praniotis. Thank you.